Can we use traditional Thomists to attack modern arguments against divine simplicity, like the modal collapse arguments? Thoughts on Christopher Thomas Wesky, Joe Schmidt, and Ryan Mullen.
I think this video will be taken down because of my thoughts on Ryan Mullins. But yeah, to answer your first question, yeah. So modal collapse objection is already answered in traditional Thomists. So you don't need to go and search for papers on like I've seen people who go on Google say, "Oh, how to refute modal collapse." Bro, you don't need that. You don't even need to read any of classical Thomists from like Baroque era. You just need to go to Lagrange, question 19, article 3. There you're gonna find an answer to modal collapse. He replies to modal collapse in his God, his existence, and his nature as well. And then Grenier replies to modal collapse in his section on the divine will, book 3 on operative attributes of God. So if you want English sources, just read those. If you want Latin sources, then go read Billard's commentary on question 19. Go read John of St. Thomas's questions. John of St. Thomas has like 60 pages dealing with divine freedom. And then, so there's a position, and that's the position of Kite, and it's some Thomists think that it's problematic, but I heard that there was a cardinal in 19th century, and he wrote a section in his book to prove that Kaiton's position was not problematic. But ignoring that, the traditional response is that, so how you define divine freedom? So divine freedom in Thomists define it as it's the very necessary act of God. So the free act of God is not a super added act to the divine essence. It's just a very necessary act of God. But that act has a non-necessary termination outside God Himself, and that's because God's divine will does not depend on secondary objects. Because if it did, then God's will would be essentially dependent on something which is infinitely inferior to Himself. So God's object of the divine volition is specified by his primary object of the divine volition, which is his divine essence. So we say that God wills himself or his own essence of absolute necessity, but he doesn't need to will secondary objects because he doesn't need them because his goodness is already perfect without them. If he did need them, then he would have to will them in order to attain the end. But we know that God doesn't need to attain the end that he himself is with those secondary objects because his goodness is the very essence. So he doesn't participate in any goodness. He just is goodness. So the divine will does not depend on secondary objects in any way. And from this, it follows that those secondary objects are willed freely, not necessarily. And so the same one and the same necessary. This is why St. Thomas says that God does not will himself by one act and creatures by another act, but that by one and the same necessary act, he wills himself necessarily and creatures freely. He wills himself necessarily because the divine will is specified by the divine essence itself, but he wills creatures freely because those objects do not specify God's act. And the same applies to the divine knowledge. And this is one of our critiques of Molinism and their middle knowledge. So both the divine knowledge and the divine will, they're both specified by the primary object. So there's another form of modal collapse which says, oh, suppose that God had created some other universe. So in that sense, it seems that God could have had different knowledge. So his act would essentially change. In reply, we do not say as some authors suggested, oh, that means God's act of knowing and willing are extrinsic to God. No, we just don't say that because we think that act of knowing and willing can in no way be extrinsic. And you can read proofs for this in Aristotle's Metaphysics book 9, chapter 8, where he proves that willing and knowing are perfections of the agent. So anyways, so when they say, oh, if had God willed differently, had God created differently, then wouldn't that mean that God would have had different knowledge and different acts of willing? You just reply that no, because nobody is claiming that God's act is specified by those secondary objects. And since it is not specified by them, God's secondary objects of his act of knowing and willing can differ, but the act is not going to differ because act is specified by something immutable, which is his essence. So whether God created or not, the act is going to remain the same because he knows and wills the divine essence of absolute necessity. And that means that there's no change on the part of God's act, even though he can choose different secondary objects or effects to put into being.